1982's First Blood was a modest film adaptation that would spawn a franchise of multiple sequels. It would get a Saturday morning cartoon series, many different video games, different toys, a novel series, and an array of merchandise. I'm going to dive into First Blood and how it was developed, how it was produced, how it performed. We'll talk about my favorite scenes and the movie overall to explore how, in the hands of Sylvester Stallone, Rambo would become an action icon. So let's get into it.
Sylvester Stallone. This time, he's fighting for his life. First Blood.
Now, there was no short supply of action movies in the early 80s, but I think Rambo really was able to resonate with people because of just that humanity in the Rambo character. I mean, sure, he's essentially a larger-than-life super soldier, but he's held inside of a man that was emotionally broken from the Vietnam War. Rambo in this movie is a victim of circumstance, and when triggered, his mental breakdown at the hands of some rough cops results in a gritty, very visceral war inside of this small town, as well as inside of Rambo's head. Now, First Blood is a very raw film emotionally and visually, which really is perfect for the theme of this story of a war hero coming home that just wanted to get something to eat. It's filled with tension and suspenseful action as Rambo uses his survival skills to defend himself against a manhunt, and with no short supply of practical stunt work and effects, the visual appeal of this movie hasn't really tarnished a bit at all over the years. So let's get into First Blood first by talking about its development. First Blood is actually a film adaptation of the 1972 novel of the same name by Canadian writer David Morrell. This book that took a dark look at the pre-PTSD soldier returning home was an instant hit, and the year of its release, Columbia Pictures bought the rights for First Blood for $175,000. Their intention for this story would have seen a more sympathetic portrayal of Brian Dennehy's Teasel than in the novel, and then what we saw in the actual final production. This would have tried to weave a comparison of Americans' perception between the Korean and the Vietnam War, with Teasel having some animosity towards Rambo because of his feeling forgotten for his own defending of the country, with an ending that would have seen Teasel ordering his men to lower their weapons to try and convince Rambo to surrender, only for Rambo to take a fatal shot from an unknown shooter. Unfortunately, though, for Columbia Pictures, it was still only 1972. The Vietnam War was still actually underway, so it was far too soon for the movie to move forward. You fast forward a handful of years, and Warner Brothers buys the rights to First Blood for $125,000. Their script was written by Walter Newman, and it would have focused more on a criticization of the American military culture at the time, with Colonel Troutman being the film's villain and both Rambo and Teasel dying at the end. However, things didn't move forward. From there, First Blood would go through many more writers and a revolving door of directors, which in the industry is referred to as development hell. But in the late 70s, roughly 77 or 78, Cinema Group optioned the script to First Blood from Warner Brothers for $25,000. Some revisions were made. This would be the first version of the film with Rambo living, and production was actually set to begin in Georgia, but the bottom of everything fell out when Filmway, the intended financier of the film, was acquired by Orion Pictures. So as you can see, it was a long and bumpy road bringing Rambo to the big screen for the first time, despite frequent interest and multiple attempts, but the journey of First Blood getting a green light still wasn't finished. Next up came Mario Kassar and Andrew Vania. They read First Blood. They really wanted this adaptation to be the first film produced under their studio, Kuroko Pictures. Up until this time, Kuroko Pictures was mostly living off the foreign distribution sales of various producers. They were not yet the Kuroko Pictures that us 80s movie geeks would know to grow and love, and Kassar and Vania were interested. They bought the rights from Warner Brothers for, I think, $375,000. They purchased Sackheim and Kozel's script for $125,000, and like that, First Blood was officially back on. And Kassar and Vania, after offering to fund another of his future films, got director Ted Kotcheff back on board, who was already loosely involved with First Blood back in '76. He offered the role of Rambo to Stallone, who accepted after reading the script. At this time, Stallone was gaining some star power because of his two Rocky movies, so so he was able to rewrite the script to make Rambo more sympathetic and to have him not directly kill anybody, which I think would prove at this time to be a very wise decision. In Morell's book, Rambo kills many of the people that are after him. Sackheim and Causel's script had him killing 16 people. Stallone also opted to keep Rambo alive at the end, and what he said to kind of send a message to the veterans that there is hope and that death isn't the only end of this path. It's been reported Stallone completed 7 revisions to the script, which was later worked on by more writers at the request of Kotcheff. Kotcheff did film a suicide scene for Rambo, but both Kotcheff and Stallone, and I think some of the test audiences, really did feel that Rambo turning himself into Troutman was the better closing to the film. You can get the Blu-ray bonus features and look at the alternate ending with Rambo dying. It's pretty cool to see because it's always fun to see these alternate endings that have been shot for films that we know and love, and this one's really interesting because it drastically changes the outcome of this version of the story. So by this time, First Blood had passed through, as we've talked about, many different studios. It's had many different revisions to its story and to its characters, so of course there were many potential options for who would play the focal trio of Rambo, Sheriff Teasel, and Colonel Troutman. So let's go through some of those and talk about casting. Now, back in 1972, when Columbia Pictures had First Blood, it was to focus on the contrasts of a Korean War veteran with Teasel and a Vietnam veteran in Rambo, with both Burt Lancaster and Lee Marvin in talks to play Teasel. Then when Warner Brothers had it, both Robert De Niro and Clint Eastwood were in talks for Rambo. Then another director entered the picture. Robert Mitchum was in talks for Teasel with Paul Newman to play Rambo, which changed again when yet another director was brought into the mix who considered James Caan, Burt Reynolds, Robert Redford, Al Pacino, and Steve McQueen before quickly rejecting him once it was realized McQueen was too old to play a Vietnam vet. Another revision of the script was leaning towards John Travolta as Rambo, with George C. Scott as Colonel Troutman and either Gene Hackman or Charles Durning considered for the Sheriff Teasel role. Other considerations for Rambo were Powers Booth, Michael Douglas, Nick Nolte, and even Dustin Hoffman. This leads us back to Kassar and Vanya and Carolco Pictures. Now, they had approached Gene Hackman and Robert Duvall for the role of Teasel, who both turned them down. Lee Marvin passed on the role of Colonel Troutman as well before Kirk Douglas was eventually cast. The only problem was Douglas was a big name. He wanted script approval, he wanted Troutman to have more screen time, and he wanted to retain the original ending of Rambo dying. So without getting his way, he left the film, and I can really kind of see Douglas's perspective. At the time, he was a much bigger star, particularly overseas, than Stallone was, so he assumed he would be the international draw for First Blood. Rock Hudson was the next option, and he was interested in working with Stallone, but he had to pass due to an upcoming heart surgery. That's when Richard Crenna received a late Saturday afternoon phone call offering him the part, and Crenna was on a flight to British Columbia. And really, I mean, despite the heavyweight names in contention for Colonel Troutman, I can't see anybody else playing this role more effectively than Crenna did. Much like Brian Dennehy with his performance as Teasel, I couldn't dig up too much information on his casting other than that director Ted Kotcheff always stated that he wanted Dennehy for the role, and I agree. Dennehy brings the needed gusto to this character as a veteran himself that feels threatened and maybe insecure of Rambo because of old value thinking and the perception of soldiers returning home from Vietnam compared to his time in the Korean War. And I really liked the office scene showing his own medals, which was really a subtle reminder of that. Now let's get into production. With a cast in place and a story set, First Blood hit the mountains of British Columbia, Canada, with a shoot that ran from November of '81 to April of '82, and production was a bumpy road. There were periods of unseasonably warm weather that hindered the intended overcast settings. There was a period of heavy snowfall as well that delayed production for 2 months, including the scheduling of a couple large action set pieces, and not to forget the many delays from injuries to the cast, including Stallone, that I'll get into a bit more here in a minute. Production running over schedule quickly inflated the original budget of $10 million, which resulted in Crenna's role as Colonel Troutman being cut back a lot to avoid having to pay him the higher fees that were stated in his contract. And to be honest, I don't think it actually hinders the movie very much. Crenna has his few scenes, and I think each one of them leaves a massive imprint on the film, so cut back or not, Crenna is able to leave his mark on this movie and in the franchise. Another major issue on set was the theft of several firearms that were used for filming. These were real guns, roughly $50,000 worth, that already had to be imported into Canada. They were stolen from the lockbox in the back of a truck parked on the set, and when the film crew arrived in the morning, there were no signs of forced entry. The dummy guns were untouched, and somewhere between 75 and 100 firearms were stolen. These weapons had been modified to shoot blanks, but according to the Royal Mounted Canadian Police, these could have easily been modified back again to be able to fire live rounds. From there, the Canadian Army would guard the remote film set, and many would serve as extras in the filming of the movie. Once filming was completed, the first rough cut of First Blood was over 3 hours long, and Stallone and his agent both said they felt sick to their stomachs while watching, feeling that it was going to be a career killer for Stallone. Stallone even offered to buy the film negatives outright so he could destroy it, but cooler heads prevailed, and after some extensive editing sessions, it was cut down to a slim 93 minutes and ready for theaters. First Blood would be released on October 22nd on 900 screens, a mild month for movies as the bigger titles post-summer are usually reserved for the holiday season. First Blood would open at number 1, beating out Halloween 3 with a $6.6 million weekend. It would hold the number 1 spot for 3 weeks. It would hold a spot in the top 5 for 7 weeks and finish with $47.2 million domestically, $78 million internationally, for a worldwide total of $125.2 million on a mere $15 million budget, and First Blood would also become the highest grossing October movie of all time. It would also be the first major Hollywood blockbuster to be released in China when it was presented in theaters in 1985. It would sell 70 million tickets and be the highest grossing Hollywood film in the country all the way up until 2018. Now, for his work, Stallone reportedly requested a $3.5 million paycheck. Kassar and Vanya countered with $2 million, promising another $1.5 from television sales, and I think everybody did okay. First Blood would be the 13th highest grossing film of 1982, and it would be one of the most rented titles on Betamax of all time. Now, for those of you wondering what Betamax was, it was the format before VHS, which I'm sure First Blood thrived on financially as well. Now let's talk about some of the injuries that took place on the set of First Blood. This was the very early 80s. There wasn't CGI, and all the sophisticated safety gear and harnesses of today weren't available either. There is a lot of practical action in First Blood, and along with it came many injuries that set back production. Now, to his credit, Stallone did a bulk of his own stunts. He certainly paid the price for it. He got a lot of scratches and bites from the rats during the case sequence that required him having to go to the hospital for some shots. During the sequence where Rambo was fleeing into the mine shaft to escape the gunfire, he accidentally placed his right hand on a squid that went off, and he said he felt so much pain that he thought he blew his thumb off. But his most notable injury would come during his cliff jump scene down into the tree, where he broke a rib when colliding with the branch just to catch his fall on the second take. Brian Dennehy wanted to do his own stunt when Teasel falls through the ceiling of the police station in the final act, which resulted in him shattering some ribs when he landed. Stallone accidentally broke the nose of Alf Humphrey, who played the deputy Rambo, elbows in the face. This is why later in the film you can actually see Humphreys with a bandage on his nose, and most severe was when stuntman Benny Dobbins suffered a compression lumbar fracture after the first take launched his car way too high, causing him to slam flat down on its chassis and roll over for several hundred feet. Fortunately, though, he was able to continue working in the business on films like Commando, The Running Man, and many others until his passing in 1988. But as a stunt coordinator, from digging it, looks like First Blood would be the last time he'd ever be credited on a film as a stunt double. But like I said, luckily he was still able to consistently work. Stunt work is extremely dangerous. The realism it gives a film is something you cannot just get from digital, and you always have to show mad respect to the men and women that put their lives on the line for our entertainment. And we definitely need a stunt category in the Academy Awards very, very soon. Now, with all that said and done, let's get into another focal part of First Blood, that being its musical score. Musical legend Jerry Goldsmith composed the score to First Blood, and his theme, It's a Long Road, would be featured on the sequel films and the animated spin-off series, and you can't deny the impact that his scoring has on this film and the Rambo character overall. It's just a very moving score. It gives emotional layering to Rambo while also capturing his broken emotions, and there are frequent times where the scoring in this film is able to convey Rambo's feelings without him even having to say a word, like the scene where he gets dropped off at the end of the road by Teasel in the beginning. Or when he has flashbacks of war when looking at the dead body of Sergeant Galt. A visual flashback isn't needed or any spoken words, just the music and the physical acting, and really you can get the intention of the scene. And there are so many moments like these where a fantastic film score is able to completely impact a film in a positive way, and Rambo's theme is memorable. The 80s was known for amazing movie scoring, and even with its variations throughout the sequels, Goldsmith's music is able to serve as the heartbeat of John Rambo. And I think all of these aspects of filmmaking, the casting, the acting, the stunt work, the on-location shoot, the writing, the heart of the character and the scoring, as well as the cinematography and the direction, I think everything in First Blood just gelled into a film that delivered much more substance than you would get normally in your typical action movie during that time. Something else I really like is that the escalation of the tension is consistent. The skill set of Rambo evolves as well to create that one-man army mystique, but in a surprisingly, I would say, grounded way, something the sequels would completely abandon. Rambo just has his trusty knife, his survival skills, his ingenuity, and little else, so you can easily root for his success. And I think the finale of First Blood is just a textbook closing for an emotionally driven action flick like this. Rambo destroys this small town, and all the explosive carnage all these years later is still a visual treat for action movie fans. Rambo and Teasel's showdown at the end does not disappoint, and Rambo's closing with Troutman is just the emotional cherry on the cake that will have you wiping a tear from your eye. Now let's get into my picks for the top 3 emotional moments, not action set pieces, but just impactful scenes in the movie that I think leave the most lasting impression on First Blood. And first up at number 3, I would have where the film opens, the opening scene where Rambo goes to see his old friend Delmar Barry and learns that he's died of cancer from exposure to Agent Orange during the war. You can just really in this scene see the last shred of happiness and childlike innocence just run from Rambo's face. It's also the last time you see the sunshine in the film, and it's really a gripping moment to kind of set this entire story in motion. Coming up next at number 2, I have Colonel Troutman's opening sequence in the tent with Teasel, where he explains who Rambo is and what he's capable of. The bravado in this scene and the writing is just world class, and Troutman delivers it perfectly.
A man who's been trained to ignore pain, ignore weather, to live off the land, to eat things that'll make a billy goat puke.
And for my number 1 pick, of course, you have to go with the closing scene with Rambo breaking down in front of Troutman. I think Stallone was heartbreaking in this sequence, and his monologue is just hauntingly delivered, and to this day, it's one of Stallone's best stretches of acting. Also, I think Richard Crenna in this sequence, with nothing but his eyes and his expressions, is able to show so much pain and remorse that he feels for Rambo, and together, I think these two guys give First Blood the perfect closing. Now let's get into the fun stuff, the meat and potatoes, my top 3 action scenes from First Blood. And for number 3, I'd have to start off with the dirt bike chase sequence that winds up out on the logging roads. I think it's a thrilling sequence. The practical stunt work is adrenaline pumping, and I think it's just so well shot and visually appealing overall. Next up at number 2, I have to pick the forest sequence where Rambo isn't killing but systematically maiming Teasel's crew of deputies with little to no effort out in the woods on a stormy late afternoon. I think there's so much atmosphere to this sequence, and the tension and the suspense that it builds is really perfect for the middle of this movie. And for my number one action sequence, it would have to be the cliff jump. I mean, the entire sequence on the cliffside with the helicopter is just so well shot and skillfully orchestrated, and is still just as visually stunning all these years later. And that's it for today, guys. That concludes my little retrospective look back at 1982's First Blood. It's still the best film in the franchise, and when going back and rewatching, it's easy to see why this character would leave such an impression on audiences, ones that would reach global levels with 1985's Rambo First Blood Part 2, which I'm going to be giving a retrospective look at here in the near future, so be on the lookout for that one. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, as always, and until the next one, movies never say die.
This is Jack Burton in the Pork Chop Express, and I'm talking to whoever's listening out there.
Survive a war, you gotta become war.
I suppose we have to register you as a lethal weapon.
You trying to say Jesus Christ can't hit a curveball?